Welcome back to DAP Books Podcast. I'm your host, Willie Roberry, and today we are joined with the author of Higher Ground, How the Outdoor Recreation Industry Can Save the World, Luis Benitez.
Thank you for having me, Willie.
Hi, it's nice to meet you. I guess we met when you arrived this morning, but...
This is the first time to the offices in LA, so first time in the studio, first time actually meeting people.
Yes. I talk about this all the time on this podcast, particularly because a lot of people have come in, not for the podcast, but like if they live in California, they drive up for it. You've made a day of it.
Yeah.
So
all the way from Colorado for the
Yeah.
whole day. Yeah.
The whole day, just the day.
Yeah.
Fly in
but,
this
I
morning,
think
fly out tomorrow.
I had to put a
today.
face behind the email, and we've been communicating for so long about this project, and having DAP bring this project to life has been a really special process.
Yeah, we usually like to start at the beginning of things for this. You're known as, you've probably noticed that I shortchanged you in our little introduction, but I think it's because I can't speak to all of your accomplishments because you can explain them better than I ever could. Your most notable accomplishment, at least how I heard of you first, is that you led the first blind man to the top of Mount Everest. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, a large portion of my life was working in the Himalayas as a professional high altitude mountaineer and guide. But really the trip that changed the trajectory of that career was the one that you just talked about as Eric Weinmayer's guide. He was the first blind person to climb Mount Everest. And at the time, any guide with a significant resume or professional standing really wouldn't touch that expedition with a 10-foot pole. And the reason why was the thinking was pretty clear that if anything happened to him, the guides were going to be culpable for it, which would kind of be a career killer. But also, if that happened, who's ever going to want to go climbing with the guide that intentionally brought a blind person to Mount Everest? So it was a team of climbers from Colorado, half of which had never been to the Himalayas before, including me. My Mount Everest trip was actually the second time that I had been to the Himalayas. And we confounded all expectations. Everyone got to the summit, got back down safely, and the rest went to the history books.
It's interesting that you said that it would be a career ender if anything happened to Eric when you climbed up. What made you want to do that in the first place? As someone who wasn't maybe as experienced as you could have been, since you said it was your first time.
Yeah, it was my first time on Everest, second time in the Himalayas. First time was trying a new route in the Annapurna region where we bit off way more than we could chew. So my entire experience of the Himalayas up to that point was really just of failure and not summiting anything. And, one of the things that captured my attention in working with Eric, my initial experience in the outdoors was as a mountaineering instructor for Outward Bound. So if you know anything about Outward Bound or about NOLS, these wilderness education schools focus as much on the journey as the technical skills that you gain during that process. So when you're teaching an alpine mountaineering course for Outward Bound, you're not just teaching the technical skills, you're also actually imparting the soft skills. What does effective communication look like? What does true leadership look like in periods of stress and adversity? What does compassion look like in the mountains and in that space? And also, I think what led me to Eric is, one of the things we always focused with our students was you're capable of more than you know. There's more in you than you ever thought possible. And when Eric approached me with this idea, I just recognized very clearly here was an industry and a community telling him what he can and can't do, what he should and shouldn't do, and that wasn't okay with him. And so for me, I couldn't think of a more special way to go to Everest for the first time.
That's a nice little story. I think because I read your book a while ago, and when you're saying that,
and over again. Thank you. You helped me with all of it.
Okay, now it's not the time for flattery. This was a
Fair.
segue. In your book, you talk about how when you were a kid, you went through something kind of similar. You were an asthmatic as a kid, and it was really bad to the point where they said you wouldn't be able to
really go outside and play.
Yeah. I mean,
it's in a child's terminology, which is really where my experience was. The doctors were very clear with my parents that, get used to your son being incredibly sick for the rest of his life. He'll have to be on serious medications for the entirety of his life. His lungs just aren't strong enough to handle how bad the asthma is and how bad the allergies are. And fortunately for me, that was just not okay with my parents. They really sought out alternative options for getting my lungs stronger. Finally found a doctor that was willing to push it a little bit and say, there are ways to help him make his lungs stronger, even in the midst of being a sick little kid. One of which was swimming at an indoor swimming pool, because the chlorine actually makes the air denser, which reduces the allergen count. So it actually is a better place to breathe and to exercise and to exist. And I remember his name was Dr. Bowles, said to my parents, have him hold his breath underwater for as long as he can and clock it. And the next day you come back, have him do it longer. See if he can go a quarter length of the pool, a half a length of the pool, the full length of the pool. And honestly, I credit the Little Debbie swim team that I joined as an 8-year-old for really helping me understand how to live in my body and realize that, with a little bit of a push, that you could make things better. I'm sure you've swam before. You've been underwater, right? No?
I don't know how to swim.
Tread, sink. Have you ever put your head underwater, I guess is my question.
Yes.
Okay. So when you're in that space, a lot of the noise goes away and a lot of the clutter goes away.
Oh, yeah.
And so for me, being in that space, especially someplace that was so quiet and so foreign, instead of being worried about an asthma attack, I just really focused on my breathing and what that meant to make my lungs stronger. I still went to the hospital with asthma attacks. Even after that, it was still really hard for a number of years, but bit by bit, my lungs got stronger. And still to this day, when I'm at altitude, it's a very visceral experience for me. And I think that's how I discovered my love of high altitude mountaineering, was that even when I was just getting started, when I would see other people around me struggle for breath, gasping for air, getting really freaked out by the experience, because it's not something that most people are used to, because at altitude, you're slowly suffocating. There's no other way to explain it. But because of my childhood and because of what I went through, it put me in a very comfortable space. So the more people around me started to get unnerved and somewhat fall apart, was really the place where I found the most focus and most energy.
Do you think that is probably one of your bigger strengths when it comes to you being a good mountaineering guide?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, there's a physical aspect to all of this kind of work, and I'm sure you've heard it from other authors that have done pieces with you. And for me, it was as much about being healthy and staying healthy as it was about helping people have these experiences as a guide and lead them through some of these really interesting and impactful experiences. I think what makes a good mountain guide, there's such a variety of flavor behind some of these things. It's not just the technical skills. I know a lot of really great climbers that I wouldn't trust my grandmother to guide my grandmother up anything. And I think the reason why is there's a difference between being a strong climber and a strong guide. And I think being a strong guide really, comes along with a deep understanding of the human experience and what it requires to help walk and talk someone through really intense moments.
It sort of reminded me of like a therapy session. Like if someone's freaking out and trying to like a therapist is there to soothe their nerves and kind of walk them through why they're feeling that way and say, oh, well, here's how to manage that. So I guess my correlation was just you really need someone you can rely on. And so it's good to have someone so when they speak about what they do, you can tell that they're competent in it.
Yeah. And, I think that comes with skill and experience and having really good mentors. The special connection that I have to D'Angelo Publications, and I'm sure Sequoia has told you this story, was the connection to her father as a mentor and a peer of mine. There's incredibly special people out there in the world that do this work. And oftentimes, especially in the United States, it's not as celebrated, where in other parts of the world, it's really seen as the highest art of, when you really think about it, you're leading someone through an incredibly intense environment, through a really stressful time in their life. And to your point about being trustworthy or a therapy session, I would always joke with Sequoia's father, Marty, that you have to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, priest, and rabbi all at the same time, or non-denominational. You can take the priest and the rabbi out and just say, from a spiritual experience, you need to be able to help facilitate the journey that people are on, all while making dinner and making breakfast and leading someone through technically challenging terrain. And so when I do have this high reverence for people like Sequoia's father, other guides that I've worked with over the years, because truly it's an art form that can't be replicated in any other profession or any other industry.
Mm-hmm. On the topic of Marty and Sequoia, can you actually tell us that story? I know she's told me before, but
well, what has she told you? That's curious.
Okay, she hasn't said a lot.
Okay,
but you did mention over lunch that you used to guide in New Zealand, which is where she was from and where Marty worked.
Yeah.
So can you just speak to
Yeah, so I worked for a company in New Zealand called Adventure Consultants. And when I talk about that trip with Eric on Everest really changing the trajectory of my life, it really led me towards guiding the 7 summits. So working on all 7 continents, guiding the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents. And working for a company out of New Zealand, like Adventure Consultants was, there were very few Americans at the time that were working for New Zealand companies and also working in New Zealand, period. So I had heard about Marty well before I had met him. And so having time with him, we were on Mount Aspiring the first time that we were together, and hearing him tell stories about his kids, about Denali and Sequoia, and his life and his journey. Never in a million years thinking that his daughter would be publishing my book was one of the most special full circle moments of my life. And it's been really neat to watch Sequoia and her business acumen, this publishing company, grow over the years. And when this idea popped up, there was no one else that I wanted to talk to but her to get this done. So when I say this truly was a family affair, hopefully Marty's smiling down on this whole process.
Can you tell us how you even came up with the idea to put everything into a book?
For years, I told people all I ever wanted to do was be a mountain guide. That was the sum of my ambition. As with most people in the guiding industry, when you reach the level where you're guiding in the Himalayas, you have expeditions year round. It's the thing that drives you. It's how you pay the bills. And truly, even though a lot of people don't believe it, it was the sum of my ambition. It's all I ever really wanted to do, was be a guide and own a guiding service. And then in 2006, I was guiding on a mountain on the border between Tibet and Nepal called Cho-Oyu. And Cho-Oyu is the 6th highest mountain in the world, and there's a low pass right next to the mountain that Tibetan refugees utilize to cross out of Tibet, go through Nepal, and get to Dharamsala, India, where the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government reside in exile. You know all this as a mountain guide on Cho-Oyu, and think about it the same way you would think of the border between the United States and Mexico. It's a very porous border. This pass on Cho-Oyu is at 18,000 feet, so there's no military checkpoint, there's no fence, there's no nothing. The Chinese rely very heavily on the fact that this border is protected just by altitude and harsh terrain. Well, that year, we witnessed a group of Tibetan refugees that were working really hard there's no other way to say it, escape Tibet, leave Tibet to get to India. And turns out that for that group, the Chinese Border Patrol had been tipped off that they were actually attempting a border crossing. And so, to shorten a very long, complicated story, we were witness to the first true human rights crimes against humanity from the Chinese towards the Tibetans in 50 years. We witnessed Chinese refugees get gunned down in cold blood right in front of base camp. And at the time, being at sort of the upper echelon of the guiding community, we were on our way out of base camp when all this happened. And this was about a quarter mile away from base camp. We were on our way out for our summit push. And what I told my clients was, there are at least 10 satellite phones in base camp by the time we come down. The world's going to know what happened. And after we came back down from our summit push and I started asking around, turns out no one had shared the story for fear of repercussions, loss of access, permits. I think the argument at the time really was, we employ Tibetan people. This is not our country. This is not our thing. This isn't our this isn't our job to talk about this. And going back to being an outward bound instructor, thinking about all of my time in the mountains with clients and with family and with friends, that just didn't sit well with me. And what it led to was ending up working for the International Campaign for Tibet, getting more versed in policy, global policy with all aspects of the outdoor recreation industry globally, led to a bunch of different jobs in a bunch of different sectors. And really the book is an extension of that journey from that moment in Tibet to now, to really understanding how this industry that most people think about as fun people doing fun stuff in fun locations with fun gear, in essence represents a $1.1 trillion economy for the United States, responsible for over 5 million American jobs. And the question I asked on Show You back then is also the question that I'm asking now in the book. What is our responsibility to that economy, and what should our political voice look and sound like?
How do you think that's changed over the years? I'm pretty young, so I haven't seen like how the outdoor recreation industry has morphed throughout the decades.
Mm.
But as long as you've been a part of it, like mountaineering and everything, how much has it evolved?
Well, I think it's evolved significantly. I think, that moment on Shoyu was really the catalyst for me to understand that if I was truly going to lean in and be involved in this conversation, that I could no longer just be a mountain guide. And that push-pull, I think, is happening a lot within the industry, where a lot of people say, can't we just make fun gear? Do we have to be political? Can't we just do fun stuff? Do we really need to be steeped on policy? I'm a surfer. I'm a climber. I'm a boater. I'm a biker. I'm not really into, quote unquote, all of these things. I'll tell you another Choyu story and how that ended, because I think it's relevant here in the context of this larger political voice. So the entire time this was going on after the incident, working for the International Campaign for Tibet in Washington, D.C., still guiding, but trying to figure out what my voice was in this space. Getting ready for another Everest expedition, and I got a call. And the person on the other end of the phone said, "Hello, Mr. Benitez, my name is Lodi Gary. I'm the Dalai Lama's special envoy in Washington, D.C., and he would like to meet you." Who gets a phone call like that out of the blue? And so I ended up going to Dharamsala, what I thought would just be a 5-minute handshake and a photo opportunity, ended up being a 45-minute conversation on community and culture that I talk about in the book. And what he said, after I blathered on about how hard this was, it cost me friends, work, a significant portion of my community and my livelihood. He said, Luis, I'd like to still be my people's spiritual and temporal leader living in the Patala Palace in Lhasa. Instead, I'm here as a refugee in exile in a country that is not my own. So basically he said, sorry, kid, you can't always get what you want. Yeah. But then he said something that I think answers your question. Sometimes you don't choose your path, he said. Sometimes your path chooses you. And now it's going to be up to you to decide how you want to show up. Do you want to stay engaged in this, or do you just want to go back to being a mountain guide, essentially is what he was asking. And I think this moment for us in the United States, and I would argue for outdoor industry segments around the world, absolutely you could just be a biker, boater, climber, skier, hiker, whatever it is that you enjoy. But the question behind that I would encourage everyone to ask themselves is, what happens to those spaces where you recreate if they're not taken care of? Who defends them? Who protects them? Who finds funding to make sure all of those things happen? And then when it comes time for push-pull for growth or development, how do we look at nature as infrastructure the same way you look at pavement as infrastructure? Not only from supporting that economy that I was talking about, but from supporting public health, a natural quality of life that I think anyone that lives close by a park or any kind of green space deeply relies on.
Yeah, from reading your book, I really like how you framed outdoor recreation as, I wouldn't say the only thing, but a really large part of our lives that isn't polarized in any way. Mm-hmm. Like it's the common ground that both sides of any argument can agree on, that this is
Absolutely.
important and we should all
I
prioritize
think it's
it.
the one of the few remaining nonpartisan economies in the United States. I think if you can talk to anyone that loves something in the outdoors, regardless of political stripe, it begins and ends with a conversation about what you love. And not only what you love, but what you want to protect for the next generation because of that love. That doesn't know any political boundaries. And I think understanding how that connects to that larger conversation of what this industry is capable of and can do, in an era of real divisiveness in the United States, I think this is the one sweet spot. There's a reason why President Roosevelt called the great outdoors in the United States America's best idea. We still have it. People from around the world come here to experience it. And so really what we're talking about at this point, and what I'm trying to talk about in the book, is just galvanizing that moment.
I really appreciate how many authors we have who work in the outdoor space, or who are like climbers or mountaineers of some sort.
I think that's probably because of Sequoia. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah, that's the reason we have them here. But I mean, their shared philosophy is always so wonderful to tap into, because no matter what their personal philosophies are, all of them believe that if you're so in tune with the world around you and the rock and the mountains, you're like tapped into the spirituality of humanity, and you're all riding that same line. So being able to utilize it in a way that's benefiting the country and policy, or changing. I'm not very good with political talk or policy talk.
That's the point, though, right? The fact that we're having this conversation and you're asking the questions and you're curious, as you represent the next generation. I mean, honestly, that's what it's all about. And at the end of the day, when you start, the job that I held for the state of Colorado, overseeing the outdoor industry for the state, back then there were only two of us. Utah had an outdoor industry office director and Colorado had a director. Now there are 21 states in the U.S. with that office that report directly to their governors. So when you think about the political gravity of what's going on, sure, there's a bunch of policy nerds that think about this very, very deeply and try to strategize around what the next steps are. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, is your generation asking the question of, shouldn't this be more important than it is right now? Shouldn't this have more gravity and more relevance to the overall conversation about how we take care of ourselves as a community and as a culture than it does right now? So just the fact that you're asking this question, regardless of the podcast, I think is really special.
Well, thanks. You're the one who kind of broke it down into understandable terms. I feel like even though your book is very informative, there's a lot of numbers.
Borders on wonky, I know.
I know. It's like hard to retain, but after reading it, I felt like I understood things a lot better, even though I didn't like understand the intricacies that you got into at some points. So it's a really great read, even if some things go over your head.
Well, and I credit you and Alma and Sequoia and the whole team and Kim really helping me understand, that the moment of vulnerability for me in the book is really, you could just dump a bunch of statistics into a book and have it be a policy wonky thing. But what you all helped me understand was that in order to really make it something special, I needed to bring my own personal stories, my own vulnerability to that process to ensure that the data connected to something real. And so that moment of vulnerability for me in writing this was incredibly special. And I don't think I would have gotten there without everybody's help.
You did a great job with it, though. It was really nice to follow the line of how your life was influenced and changed from everything. Like you said, or rather like you were told when you're in DC and you had that 45-minute conversation, your life path chooses you. Yeah. And I feel like you're kind of just thrown into being a pioneer of this.
That's a big word.
Well, yeah, but it's also, like you said, you talk about it in the book in more detail, but you went to, I'm trying to remember the details, but I remember you being sent to Montana to discuss more
with then Governor Bullock. Yeah. I mean, and that was sort of the thrust of, I was lucky enough to have a boss at the time, then Governor, now Senator Hickenlooper, who basically said, and I don't know of any other governor that would encourage this. At the time, he said, go out and talk to other governors. Try to help them understand that this is really important to their state. And if their state's economy is 10% or more seated in all this outdoor industry stuff, then they should have this office too. So go out and try to talk to them and convince them. Never knew that sales was also going to be a part of that job, but apparently it was. And that meeting with Governor Bullock in Montana was really just an example of the fact that, we all have a voice in this process. There are still times on this journey when I would look in the mirror and say, still just a mountain guide. I have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea how I got here. But I'm going to try to do my best with the opportunity that's in front of me to help make this better. And I think for me, and with what you're talking about with the book, beyond the D'Angelo publication team, Frederick Reimers, my co-author, is someone that I've known as an Outward Bound instructor for 20 years. He's watched me grow up. We've watched each other grow up. He's become an amazing journalist. This being the keeper of my voice and somewhat of that history and being willing to push when I needed it in this project, I'll also be forever grateful to him, because I don't know if some of that humanity would have come out, not only with some of these stories, but the process itself. Because after things like meeting with the governor of Montana, I'd call Frederick. I'd call his nickname's Rico. I'd call Rico. It's like, well, how was it? What'd you learn? What was it? And so over a period of years and years and years, I would just call him to sort of debrief the process, and he would record it. And he told me, Whitten, this might not ever be anything, but at least we've got a running journal of what you've tried to do in this space. So when the book came about, we had a lot of content and a lot of collateral to pull from for some of those stories.
Oh, that's a cool. I always like hearing the stories of books that started as something else.
Mm-hmm.
Like if this were just accounts or recordings of you.
Yeah.
It's cool that it compounded into this eventually.
Yeah, and some of these stories in here, some of the personal ones as well, are stories that have been told from other points of view, like the Cho'oyu story. This is the first time I've talked publicly about my experience through that whole process. And also some of the things that I couldn't talk about until now, like testifying in front of the Supreme Court in Spain for crimes against humanity, where they tried the former president of China using the universal law in absentia for crimes against humanity. And I was the only witness, and I couldn't really talk about that until now. So a lot of the stories that are in here, to your point, have been told through other lenses, but this is really the first time that I've told them through my point of view.
It's kind of intense having it all compiled into one place. You've lived a pretty
Yeah, it's a vulnerable moment. I was talking to Sequoia about that a little bit earlier. It's one of those things that, as I said before, the sum of my ambition was just to be a mountain guide, whether people believe that or not. And being able to step forward and share all of these stories and share this experience, it's been a really nerve-wracking but incredibly special process.
Do you think there is a specific moment? Because clearly you're very much more than a mountain guide now. Was there like a moment
old.
where that switched? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think we have these thoughts of who we are and what we try to be in the world. And it's influenced by our parents that have expectations of us that turn into expectations of ourselves. That sort of lead to this formula of who you get to become and who you get to evolve into. I mean, I'll be the first one to say I haven't got it right all the time. I've made tons of mistakes like everybody else. Disappointed more people than I can count along the way. But I think that the tipping point that you're talking about in realizing that there was a responsibility here was really when I got the job overseeing the industry for the state of Colorado. Colorado has been my home. Oh boy, for over 20 years. And it's been a place that it's always given so much to me in the sense of family, culture, community, places to recreate, and really just a love of place. Governor Hickenlooper, now Senator Hickenlooper, calls that topophilia, which is this intense love of place. And for me, that's Colorado. And I remember waking up the first week that I accepted the state job working for him, overseeing the industry, and just kind of lying in bed the same way you would as a new guide, lying in your tent and realizing these clients' lives are my responsibility. I remember lying in bed thinking this entire economy, all of these jobs, everything that this industry stands for and represents in our state is now on my shoulders. And that was the moment for me when I recognized that it was time to grow up and time to be serious, and playing around is good, but that responsibility needed to supersede everything else from that point forward.
I like how you drew a comparison between the two, because I was going to ask if it was very different being a mountaineer and then being in this political sphere where you're trying to bring this to other people's attentions and grow
I think you can draw that parallel. You can use the metaphors all over the place. 1 step forward, 5 steps back. Sometimes there's a storm. Sometimes it's sunny. I mean, you can play the metaphor arithmetic as much as you want, but I think there is something to be said for, with anything having to do with government, the level of tenaciousness that you need to get anything done, and your ability to pull together disparate voices is the name of the game. And I think the patience to be able to do that and to be of service. I was talking to somebody else a few days ago, another retired mountain guide who has gotten into a different lane within the industry. And what we came down to was that, being a mountain guide is all about being of service to others. You're of service to your clients. You're of service to the local staff that you work with, the communities that you travel through. You try to show up in a respectful, good way through the work that you do on expeditions, which in my mind's eye naturally leads to public service. I mean, because that's what it is. It's serving a citizenry and a community to the best of your ability, to represent what's possible. And if that's not the definition of a mountain guide, I don't know what is.
The definition of a mountain guide. And now you're pulling that into... So do you think your other strengths as a mountain guide, like your experience doing that for work for so long, has better equipped you for, what you go over in this book, which is government policy?
Yeah, I don't know. There are a lot of times that I felt like, there's most people in the outdoor industry end up hacking their education. Like, I'm going to go over here and get a little thing of that. I'm going to get a little piece of this. Everybody cobbles together a career and an education to sort of find their way. At our core, I think the outdoor industry is an industry of makers and creators, whether you're creating gear or an experience across the board. And to your earlier question about understanding what some of these skills are that you have that are translatable, but also how do you get more in this space? One of the things that I tried to focus on because of my own experience when I was in the chair for Colorado was really understanding what education and workforce development looked like for the industry. We are the only $1 trillion economy in the United States that I would argue that is pretty much run by people that have hacked their education. I know a lot of CEOs that don't have a bachelor's degree. I know a ton of startup presidents that have very little formal education, but through mentorship and apprenticeship and also getting the education at the right time and the right way, have sort of cobbled together what they've needed to be successful. And I'm no different. I definitely, went to school to be a mountain guide. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a wilderness instructor. Some of those skills were translatable, but when it came time to be responsible for an entire state's economy in the outdoor industry, I knew I needed to go back to school. So I ended up getting my professional executive MBA later in life. And I remember sitting down with the dean of the school and him saying, "You're going to have to work harder than everybody. This MBAs are filled with people from finance, business. They've got a majority of this background. What you have seems to be enough, but let's see if you can actually hack it." And, for me, it was an incredibly difficult time in my life, but it was also really exciting because for the first time I got that if you are given a little bit of room in your life to instead of being forced into education, finding the right thing at the right time that fits you when it's most relevant. I sucked up every moment of it to the point where then I went on to do post-grad work to talk about behavioral sciences and public policy to really understand how people engage with policy work when it's most relevant to them at the kitchen table and the conversations you have as a family. So finding that later in life was really exceptional, but I think it's also indicative of what we're talking about, that the industry is in this moment where we kind of have to grow up a little bit to understand how to take care of some of these challenges. And just saying somebody else is going to take care of it at some other time and it's really not my responsibility, I think the time has come to really change that dialogue.
Yeah, that's actually, I like having this conversation a lot about education and people getting into the positions that they're able to get into
Mhm.
because of their education alone. My father, he just works in a factory, but he's in a senior position where I think he was promoted like a year or two ago. And everyone else in his position are all like mid 20s with a degree
Mhm.
in something. And he's the only one who's worked for 15 years and gotten all this experience from working there. And he's kind of in a room full of people who don't really know what they're doing, but know what they should be doing. Like
Uh-huh.
theoretically,
Yeah.
this is what should be happening, but they don't know how it all plays out. I think with so many people go into college because their goal is to get a specific job,
Mhm.
but you went back to college after knowing that you needed it for the job you're like progressing into,
Mhm.
but it was like tangential to what you've already been doing and have done. So I feel like your experience is really like it will take you so much farther than the other people in like the same program who might go into the same field because you do have all of that knowledge stashed. Oh my goodness. You have all of that knowledge stashed away.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, reflecting back on it now, and thinking about it, I had a newborn baby at home, was doing this job for the state, a new government job for an office that never existed before. And I put myself in a master's program. I just, like, I don't think you could be any more of a glutton for punishment. But, going through it and really understanding, for me, the capacity for change and growth, and really recognizing that our industry lacks that a little bit. I'm incredibly proud of the work we did in Colorado with higher ed and academia. Now there are the first ever MBA just focused on the outdoor recreation industry now exists. There are master's programs focused on the outdoor industry economy. There are bachelor degrees that also focus on marketing skills, finance skills, just for our industry. Law schools focus just on water law and law around climate initiatives and sustainability. So, for
Mm.
the first time, I think higher ed is starting to see this economy, this thing, this community, as really needing the next generation of leadership. And so, while you still have choices about how you get there, which I think is incredibly important, our industry is one. To the example of your father, I think is perfect. Dropping somebody into a lot of these jobs just with that formalized education without experience will not be half as valuable as starting with that experience and getting to the same spot.
Yeah, and it's probably how you've been so effective at getting everything started because
Mm,
like you said the what was it? The office didn't exist before you. And those programs at schools, they didn't have an outdoor recreation
yeah. Yeah. No.
degrees.
And I tell this story in the book, and it was one of the first assignments I had in working for the governor. Still unpacking my pencils, trying to figure out where to plug in the computer, trying to get my head wrapped around what it was that I was doing. The governor's office called and said, there was down in southwestern Colorado, outside of Durango, there was a gold mine that had leaked a bunch of old mining water into the river, into the watershed, and there was a significant concern if the cleanup process was going to be done in time for the summer season, because that's really when all the rafting companies, all the stand-up paddleboard companies came out to really utilize the river corridor that runs through town. And the mayor of Durango was going to host a rally, a float down the river to show the business community and the rest of the state, and frankly the rest of the world, because people come from all over the world to paddle in Durango and around Durango. And the governor's office said they're going to host a paddle. Go, you paddle, right? Go grab whatever you paddle with and get down there and get on the river and show them that we support what's going on. So while driving on the phone with a policy advisor to the governor's office, so what was the leak? What's the remediation project? What's the prognosis? Are these people getting on water that's still dangerous?
Mhm.
Okay, what's the mayor's phone number? When I get down there, who do I talk to? Okay, great, thanks. And I pull up to a parking lot just filled with rafts and stand-up paddleboards and inflatable duckies and people, in life jackets and swim gear. The whole town had really shown up to say, we believe in this process. We're grateful for the cleanup, and it's time to get back to business as usual. And somebody told me on the phone, like, I think the mayor's got a yellow helmet and a red life jacket, a red PFD. So go find him. He's going to be on a blue raft. Go tell him that you're there. And I remember I found the mayor and I said, good morning, Mr. Mayor. My name's Luis Benitez.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the Outdoor Industry Office Director for the state of Colorado. On behalf of Governor Hickenlooper, I just wanted to let you know that we're here and we're supportive of what's going on. And I'm just going to spend the day with you and hang out and talk to other business owners. And I hope that's helpful. And I'm really looking forward to going on a paddle. And you could see his gears not working. Like, okay, representative from the governor here in flip-flops and a life jacket and board shorts, carrying a stand-up paddleboard, about ready to get on the river. And he turned around to pretty much everybody that was standing here. This guy's from the governor's office and he's here to paddle with us. And everybody kind of did a 5-second pause and hooray!
Looped you up and down.
And so that, to your comment, I think one of the things I really tried hard to do, it was less about faking authenticity, but just really representing things that I love in communities that I love. And half the time, half of this battle, half of this problem is just showing up, being willing to have the conversation, whether it's with a life jacket or a suit and tie. And that moment really solidified for me what the job could be all about.
That's a great story to hear, because that one isn't in the book, I don't think.
I can't remember. Oh, we're gonna have to look over the edits. I'm not sure. It might be buried deep in there.
Guess you have to read to find out.
There you go.
On that note, we do like our authors to read an excerpt from the book before they go.
You asked me to pull something. Yes, indeed. I have one. Do you want me to read it?
Yes, please.
Okay. And it's hard to pick one that I really like, and sometimes I like to begin at the end or end at the beginning. So this is actually from the epilogue at the end, because I think it provides a little bit of a synopsis on how I try to pull all these things together. I am back where it all began, on a high peak in Ecuador. There is a peculiar chill to a high alpine stone hut at sunset. Outside, I can hear the glacier cracking and groaning, and upstairs, climbers shuffle around. I can hear the clanking of climbing equipment being prepared for our summit attempt tonight, and the soft snoring of the other guides in the room off the kitchen. Scattered around at tables are climbers from all over the world, quietly whispering as I sit and watch the steam slowly rise from my cup of tea. It seems like life has a way of bringing you back to the start, but my experience is that at each revolution of the circle, you have a chance to do it differently and better. I am on Cayambe. It's a little smaller than my beloved Cotopaxi in Ecuador, but since Cotopaxi is now reawakened into a very active volcano, our group thought it best to shift here, to the one mountain that straddles the equator. On the summit push, you actually cross from the southern hemisphere into the northern. It's a fitting metaphor for me, the journey back and forth between worlds. The belief I started with in these mountains as an asthmatic boy caught between two cultures continues to define my journey. I love stepping back into the guiding arena from time to time with groups like this to not only provide a checkup on my skills, but also as a touchstone for my intentions. My thinking has always been that time outside is good for you. The belief that our industry serves the greater good now goes well beyond conversations around tables such as the one where I now sit. It spans the country and the world to help people understand that new economies can grow, natural resources can thrive, and the type of education this industry can provide cannot be found in books or a traditional classroom.
Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you for reading.
Thank you.
And thank you for coming here today. Thank you for taking the time and flying out here to see all of us.
Such a pleasure.
Great meeting you. We love meeting our authors in person or seeing them in person and being able to actually interact. We always say, or authors always tell us rather, that the publishing firm kind of just feels like this entity that isn't full of real people.
What did I do when I first came in today? I touched
said,
the couch.
wow.
I touched the chair. I think I awkwardly touched your shoulder. I'm like,
said,
Alma's real.
Are you real?
Yeah, it's a very visceral experience to bring these things to life. And I am so grateful for all of you and everything that you've done to help me do that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that we've been able to work with you. It's been a pleasure, really.
Thank you.
For everyone listening, if you want to pick up a copy of Luis's book, Higher Ground, How the Outdoor Recreation Industry Can Save the World, you can pick it up at dapbooks.shop, our website. Take a look at our other titles too. Thank you again for coming.
Thanks for having me, Willie.
Thank you for everyone who is listening or watching. This has been the 9th episode of DAP Books Podcast with Luis Benitez. Be sure to follow us on our socials. We are DAP Books Pod on Instagram and D'Angelo Publications everywhere else. We post on our podcast every other week, so be sure to tune in 2 weeks from now, where we'll be interviewing Claire Chittum. Until then, bye. That's how we end it.
I like it. It's very NPR-ish. Bye.